Welcome to NEK VT Rocks. My guest today is Jay Walsh, and you're a local to Newport. You're an environmentalist. Mm-hmm. You recently moved here, right?
6 years ago now? 5, 6 years ago?
Well, by Vermont standards, that's brand new.
Well, it's not that we didn't live in Vermont before. We were in Western Mass, up in the corner for 16 years, and then 10 years prior to that, Southern Vermont. So not real new to Vermont.
You're just new to the NEK, relatively speaking, but so am I.
Both, so. Go from the southern border to the northern border, the farthest you can go.
And you've become really interested and involved in the health of the lake and some issues that have been brought up recently after the Agency of Natural Resources held a meeting here, which my understanding, and I was at that meeting, I recorded it, was about a permit for treating leachate. What is leachate?
Well, I knew nothing about leachate. 5 years ago.
Right.
About 4 years ago, I came across an article that was about the group Dump in town, which was primarily against the expansion of the landfill at that time. And so I read it in a newspaper article, and then they talked about leachate, and I never knew that what went into the landfill
comes out of the landfill.
Yeah, was not redistributed in some other form. And so I was curious what this leachate was. I mean, it didn't take an environmental scientist to understand that it was derived chemicals from, water running through, decomposing materials. And that would be the juice that would come out the bottom. I did learn that this was fairly new to the waste industry, about the last 40 years, because before that they didn't line landfills. Right. So it wasn't new because we knew it leaked out of the landfills and was causing contamination. And the reason for putting in lined landfills was to contain that. Never thought about the fact that, well, then it would be drained off and then
where did it go?
And disposed of. And by different means, by either aeration, sometimes into the air to evaporate it, or put back into the landfill, or spread on fields, and such, but also dumped into wastewater treatment plants.
Right, and then into bodies of water.
Correct.
And 4 years ago, the leachate from the landfill here in Coventry, which is the only landfill in Vermont, was going straight into Memphrey-Magog.
Right, and so I started digging into what leachate was all about and what were the chemical constituents in it. I do have some background in environmental work. Like most of my career was in
that's some background.
Yeah, building design and building science and dealing with chemicals, formaldehyde, radon, lead, asbestos, a number of things, and also what we contract into our bodies.
Right.
So looking at it, so I got a report as to, because the state does require them to analyze what contained in the leachate before it's disposed of. So when they send it off to a lab, it comes back with all the chemical constituents that are in it by their components that they found. But it's pretty exhaustive, but typically in my research, they run between 150 to 300 separate chemicals.
Right.
Of course, there's about 500 chemicals of these kinds in our bodies already without our permission.
Not that they belong there, right?
Correct, and that they weren't to be there. But so then looking at some of the chemicals, came across those, PFOAs and that series of chemicals, PFAS. Those becoming more serious. I lived in the Bennington area at the time when Hoosick Falls came into play, and then Bennington. I also ran an environmental group, green drinks group, that we were fortunate to have excellent scientists that worked at Williams College that came in and gave us early background about what these chemicals were about. So I've had, as well as research with PCBs and the Housatonic. The other partner in my environmental group has worked on that issue, with GE and their contamination for 30 years.
Right.
So, these chemicals being released in the environment weren't, or the chemicals in leachate weren't an issue. I mean, weren't an issue until they were released into the environment, and then looking at the chemicals, and then coming across other research by prominent scientists about pass-through at the wastewater treatment plant. I was like, well, what do you mean pass-through? It treats these chemicals, all of the stuff that we dump in our drains and our sinks and our laundry. It goes to the water treatment facility, and they filter it and they treat it. And little did I realize that there are very few things that it actually treated, depending on the type of system, and that many of these chemicals, which we're not testing for, passing directly through untreated, or I shouldn't even say untreated, they're semi-treated, and then some components of them are still released.
So like wiping something over the top and hoping that cleans it, but it doesn't.
Yes, yeah, it's the residuals, but then looking at these forever chemicals, which are the class of PFOA, PFAS chemicals, some 4,000 different chemicals. 9,000 at the last count. Yeah,
which is horrifying.
It's not surprising. We've introduced 140,000 chemicals into through the U.S. Most of them unregulated.
Sure.
And they barely regulate any of them in our environment. But anyway, so looking at this pass-through, it just didn't make sense to me that these chemicals weren't being treated or removed, I should say, and flowing into the rivers from these wastewater treatment facilities. And this is all over the world. I've read probably a couple hundred research papers, studying just wastewater treatment plants alone and what they do and do not do. And the majority of them talk about pass-through. And so that started concerning me. So then I started looking at some of the individual chemicals in that long list. And so it's about 150 to 200 different chemicals that are derived in leachate. So essentially there's not much water. It's mostly 99% chemicals. But this is just a short list of
and it goes on forever.
Some of the chemicals. But what I did here was that I looked at some of the highest concentrations within the leachate to see what harm, if any, they had for humans. And it was very disturbing to find that most of them were cancer-causing or related to, they're carcinogenic, or they were disruptive to the
endocrine system.
Endocrine system in our body. They have effects on sperm count. They have effects on infants. It's our exposure to chemicals, is hidden from us. Every day, the things that we apply to ourselves have chemicals in them, and this is how they get into our body, or in our food, or in our environment. And we can control a lot of these things, but things that are out of our control is when an agency, environmental agency, says that these things are okay at these small amounts.
Right.
And so we can continue to dump them into our waterways in small amounts. So I don't know why that is acceptable when I can't poison you a little bit every day, right?
Right.
And when you get ill and you die, there's nobody to blame.
Right.
And that's exactly what these chemicals are doing to us.
Right.
They're poisoning us a little bit every day, the more we put them in our environment.
And we get numb to it. We believe it because it's comfortable
and we
to
hear
believe
terms like, especially from like agencies like Natural Resources and such, is that these things are, we have acceptable levels. They meet the criteria. But when they say something like that, what they're saying is, we're only poisoning you a little bit.
Right.
Okay? So they meet levels. And that's only for the things that they want to test for or that the EPA says you must test for.
My other favorite on that is the ubiquitous word.
Well,
my partner says it's ubiquitous, shrug.
Yeah.
Meaning, who cares? We're not doing anything.
And yes, and it's like, because it's everywhere, that's just acceptable, except
it's not.
It's not everywhere because of nature.
Right.
It's everywhere because of how we've used it and how we've redistributed it.
Right.
So, the reason that they're finding PFAS in polar bears is because we're dumping this stuff into our lakes and rivers.
Right.
Well,
it's not because their pizza delivery arrives in a box that's PFAS soaked.
Well,
it does.
It eventually goes to the landfill, and it trickles down into the leachate, and then we dump it into the river.
And we poison the polar bears.
Yeah, and then it gets taken up. There's never been any more or less water in the world. It circulates.
Right.
So it gets taken up into the air, it turns into clouds, and it comes back to us. And this is the same way that that mercury it's contaminated every single lake and stream and ocean in the world, because of our coal burning, and the same thing with when we're using lead in gasoline.
Right.
So we introduce these things into our environment, and then we say, oh, well, they're ubiquitous. It's only because we've not taken care in how we use them and how we control them, and or the efficacy before we start using them. There's a lot of good that has come out of the chemical industry as far as advancements in science and how things work every day. Your car, uses probably a couple 100 of these different chemicals in order to function, or the plastic, or the plasticizers, or the oil, or the grease that's in them. But we're not paying enough attention to how they're being introduced into our bodies,
right?
And the environment. If we poison the water, really, what have we got left?
Nothing. We don't exist without water.
And so, thinking that the water system is somehow a purification protocol for all these chemicals is just ludicrous.
Yeah.
They don't break down. We built these chemicals so that they don't break down. They refer to them as short chain and long chain hydrofluorocarbons. It's like, who can wrap their head around that? The scientists that devise them, but they're developing them in that way so that they don't break down. So then, at the end of life, we're just disposing them into our environment, and then not even containing that. We thought, well, geez, if we build, a lined landfill, we're containing these things. But then to take the liquids, some of the most complex that have never been tested, you can't combine 5 chemicals without there being issues, let alone 200 different chemicals of some of the nastiest stuff we have. They've never been tested on people as to how they, how they'll affect them, or the fish in the lake, the fish in the river, the the plants that take them up, the animals that eat those plants on the side of the river. We've learned nothing.
Right. Maine has just issued a deer advisory because of the level of PFAS in deer meat, venison.
Yeah. I mean, you're finding
crazy.
it all over. The same thing in Maine, with the dairy farmer who, had to dispose of all of his cows because they were contaminated.
Right.
The Dark Water movie about,
Right.
that gentleman, I mean, that was a serious disposal where I believe it was Dow Chemical, pretty much dumping their toxins straight into this river.
Yes.
And killing his animals and such. But
and the humans.
Yeah, but we're finding more and more of this. When we're taking the sludge that comes out of the wastewater treatment plants and redistributing that as fertilizers without really testing it for all the. I mean, they do require some heavy metal testing and such of it.
But they're not testing for the chemicals, the other chemicals.
Now they are for PFAS chemicals. I don't know how many of them, but
there's all the other chemicals too, the ones that we know about and the ones we don't know about. We didn't, quote, know about PFAS chemicals before, didn't stop us spreading that liquid and the solid waste.
Right.
It's what we don't know that's equally important.
Sure. And and then there's also the efficacy of how some of these things are looked at as far as how they affect humans. So the way obviously they don't know about PFAS because they had, I don't know, a level of something like 400 parts per trillion, and then they brought it down to 180 parts per trillion, and then after Hoosick Falls and Bennington, they said, well, maybe 70. They're just shooting into the sky with numbers.
And the bottom line is none of it is good for us. Right.
And the way that they look at it, there's two different methods that they look at how these things may affect humans and the efficacy of using them. And that is, that 1 out of 1 million will have some kind of adverse reaction to these things. Mm-hmm. But that's really a false narrative as well. Right. Because in a community like this, there's a long line of your heritage. Mm-hmm. So if you are particularly susceptible to these things, which may introduce cancer or activate cancer in your system, probably your whole bloodline is along that. I mean, if you think of it, when they ask you, it's like, is there any cancer in your history? Well, they're looking at that because it does run in families. And so it's not 1 in 1 million. So a community like this, or in some of the other parts of the country that we found, it's like there's whole swaths of people, some all within their same family, developing cancers over time. But there's nothing to link them to. You just say, well, why is there more cancer? Well, there's huge cancer hospitals in every state now. 50 years ago, there were not. How can you have entire, hospitals devoted to cancer and not look at the cause? Right. Cancer just, if you look 100 years ago, was it they didn't know that people had cancer and that's what they died from? I don't think that that's the case.
That's not true. No, we know that they did know about malignancies. They may not have known the subtleties that we can look at now, but they still knew about it. And they knew something about cancer families too then.
Yeah. And that's why they, if these things are being introduced to our environment, which I don't understand why in the first place. It's
poison for profit is what it is.
Yeah, I mean, why are you taking chemicals of any sort and putting them into a river or lake at any levels to dispose of them? It just doesn't make sense to me. Now, I grew up in Western Mass, Central Mass, Fitchburg. Okay, Fitchburg had a river, the Nashua River, that ran through the center of it. That river was a different color every single day. Dark green, pink, blue, whatever color paper or textiles they were dyeing.
Right, whatever was run through it.
Was the color of that river. This was before the Clean Water Act, and a woman from a nearby town led a charge to clean up that river. And you can imagine the battle that she must have had,
right,
trying to fight the major employers and industry leaders in that area.
Yes.
Textiles, wood mills, Weyerhaeuser, GE, who had a plant right on the river because, hey,
that's how you get rid of it.
It's polluted.
What's a little more?
What's a little more? So she led a charge. It took her life, the rest of her life, about 25, 30 years, to actually see that river become one of the most pristine rivers in the country. She understood that this was not a means to dispose of them. And through the Clean Water Act and through the EPA, we've unfortunately licensed the disposal to them on our behalf. So rather than stopping the disposal, all they've done is regulated and reduced the limits and said, you can put it in a little bit at a time, it'll just be absorbed by the environment.
Right.
And it's not. We've reached the peak of our toxicity, in both our bodies and in our environment. Can't keep doing this.
Our landfill up here releases approximately 60,000 gallons a day, probably more than that. There's about to be an expansion. It's already started. That's talking about 100,000 gallons a day. That's massive.
It is, and an A&R, who's authorized these permits, they test for so little of what comes out of that pipe, and even then, they test for this downstream. This isn't at the pipe, and the one test, their go-to test, which had been up to recently, the wet test, all that was doing was they put organisms into this the chemicals that come out, and they look at how many die, how many, if they reproduce and things like that, and it just doesn't. It's not an effective look at the long-term exposure to these chemicals, because the one thing we didn't talk about is that they bioaccumulate.
Right.
And
that means they build up in your system, in wherever.
Right. And that's over time. So that's why when they talk about PFAS and a lifetime exposure, to these chemicals, it's because they stay in our bodies.
Right.
They're
and slowly erode. If you have cats, right?
Yes.
Cats are prone to thyroid disease, and that is linked quite strongly with PFAS chemicals. Now, I don't think it's because they're going swimming in the lake, but they're eating food, the canned food or the dried food that cats are eating, probably, and it's not been tested, has PFAS in it because of the meat components. Sure.
Well, meat, and then also the coatings that are used on the inside of cans.
Right.
These aren't the cans that our grandmother, opened and served us food out of.
Right.
These are coated with chemicals to make them non-stick and to actually protect the metal from the constituents
and
in
the plastic linings in the bags of cat food or other food and human food and rice and other things. That's also chemically treated.
Yes, yeah, and they list a whole slew of things that PFAS chemicals are found in, like popcorn, microwave popcorn bags, Teflon. I remember, and this has got to be 30 years ago, at least, on 60 Minutes, was an interview with a scientist from Dow Chemical, and she told the interviewer, it's like, what, you know, regarding Teflon. It's like, well, yes, like 99% of people, you know, in the world have Teflon in their blood. And the interviewer was just like, I'd never seen an interviewer shocked. He was just like, excuse me? You know, what do you know, and it was the first time I heard of that. And I didn't realize that the type of chemicals they're talking about were what we're talking about now. And that was 30 years ago. Yeah. And we'd done little to move off of that mark.
We normalized that it's okay to have a high level of any kind of chemical in your blood system, in your body. As though, yeah, you have that, but don't you want your non-stick pan? Yeah, I love my non-stick pan, but I prefer not to be poisoned for using it.
And sure, and you know, I've used ski wax.
Yes, me too.
I've used water repellents on my clothing for years. When I lived in Alaska, it's like that was a seasonal thing. You coated your boots, you coated your
Gore-Tex.
pants, you coated your jacket to make it weatherproof.
Right.
Because why? Because when I put it in the laundry,
right,
and I run the laundry, then it's pulling it off of that
and straight into the waterways.
Exactly. So, you know, it's difficult. You know, I don't think there's a week that goes by that I don't look at something I'm handling and I go, really? I should know that this has something in it. Mm-hmm. You know, this plastic container, this
your dental floss,
spray bottle, the dental floss. It's ridiculous what some of these things are put into, and it's, you know, and we've done this over and over again. Mm-hmm. You know, we put lead in paint, we put lead in gasoline,
right? For no good reason,
when it wasn't even necessary. You know, and it wasn't until health effects started to appear, and we're not looking at that now.
No, and part of the problem is the health effects show up in the areas with the most exposure, and they get called sacrifice zones for a reason. The Northeast Kingdom is a sacrifice zone. We have become the dumping ground for Vermont because we're pretty remote, so who even sees it? Question is, what do we do to change it?
Yeah, I mean, I remember growing up and seeing, there was a landfill near an airport, and mm-hmm. it was one of the main roads, and we drive by there. Oh, there's a landfill.
Right.
And there were landfills in almost every community. In Vermont, there was almost 60 landfills in the 80s when they started to close them, mm-hmm. And move towards these lined landfills. And and they're still, trying to build new landfills, and they have become larger because of their. They talk about, it's the economics of landfills, but there's one that some friends of ours are battling the development of over in Dalton, and it surprises me because. These are industry professionals that have known that these chemicals and such, they've mm-hmm. known this for 40 years.
Right.
Okay. They claim to be environmental stewards.
I'm sorry to laugh.
But yet they're only concerned about what they have to comply with.
Right.
So there's a small amount of chemicals that they have to comply with. Yet, when they're going to build a landfill or expand one, they tout their expertise in environmental design, and this is state of the art. Well, what part of state of the art is not knowing or dealing properly with the residuals that are coming off of your landfill? If you're hiring engineers, you're hiring scientists, you're doing analysis on this stuff monthly.
Right.
It's like, how can you tell me that you're building a state of the art facility, but you haven't learned to properly dispose of these chemicals, and then turn it back on the consumer mm-hmm. to say, well, this is really due to your
overuse, right?
Your usage of these products,
right?
And that you pay us to take in.
Right. We've also been fed that by ANR, by the state, who have reminded us the importance of recycling, reusing, repurposing, blah, 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 but omitted to tell us that the landfill is permitted to take a specific amount, and that if we, being good citizens, reduce what we put in, they get to make up the, quote, shortfall by importing toxins from other states.
Yeah.
So it's really a no-win.
And there's also the other side of this too, and there's the public responsibility, and this is something also that ANR is not addressing, or the Department of Environmental Conservation, or any of them, and that is, we also know from this research that not just landfill leachate produces these chemicals that go to the wastewater treatment plant and that go into the rivers. They come out of our homes as well.
Right.
So it's what we wash, it's what we flush, it's
what we put in our mouths and flush.
Exactly. All these things that are passing through. And there's been little or no educational campaign to talk to the average individual to say, we're aware these things are going through our wastewater system. We're aware that they are not being treated at the end pipe that's going out into the river. We know where they're coming from. They're coming from your homes, some of them. Please, this is what to do. Try to avoid these things. Please don't dispose of these things. We're not allowed to put gasoline or oil into our sewer systems. People do it. But we caution people not to do that for good reason, because they will pass through, they'll contaminate the treatment process at the wastewater treatment facility, and some of them will pass through into the environment. We should be doing that with all the things that we're dealing with our wastewater. You
have kids. How informed are they? Because they're the ones who are going to inherit this mess.
Well, as informed as a 12 and 15-year-old can be,
which is pretty informed.
They, because they hear Dad doing this research, they hear Dad talking about these things. My oldest, I've talked with a great deal about these things, and they're very concerned over the introduction of these things into the environment. I don't think that they've fully learned yet how to eliminate these things, or how they play into their lives on a daily basis. We do our recycling. They know about recycling. They know about chemical additives in their food, and eating clean as one can.
So how do we get young people who really are going to be the ones who inherit this mess to clean it up? How do we get them engaged in a way that stops the adults doing what they're supposed adults doing what they're doing?
One of the things that I just spoke about, and that is the educational component that's not being presented from our environmental agencies. The more, if you think about it, back in the 40s and 50s, when they wanted to get a message across, it was posted everywhere. It's like, do not do this. Do this. Protect our environment. Or when they were trying to run campaigns to, we need rubber for the war. We need metal for the war. And people pitched in. People will pitch in if they're aware of the issues, and that message is not being put out. No. I thought there was going to be a turnaround in the mid-90s when we started talking about the transportation of goods and what that effect had on our environment. That lasted about 5 or 8 years.
I was going to say 5 minutes, because we've just upped that.
And then it's disappeared. all in the vein of consumerism.
Right.
And
corporate rule.
Yeah, and that's really what we're involved in now is buy more, use more, dispose more,
right.
Buy more, use it's that's the cycle that we're in, and we haven't looked at the life cycle cost really of all these things. We did that some in my work with the U.S. Green Building Council when we were looking at materials and life cycle costing in materials and or the chemical constituents that we were trying to eliminate in the construction process, because that's got a life cycle. A building will last maybe 80 to 100
right.
years, and then it's torn apart and disposed of. How can we lessen that impact? We haven't done that with most of our consumer goods. It's
right.
How much more can you get? And
we don't
I see
make
that
the manufacturers responsible in any way for what they're producing.
Very, very minor. There's slaps on the wrists. There's, probably the last big thing in my life that really have seen was with the ozone layer.
Yes.
And the world stopping using chemicals, sprays and other refrigerants and such worldwide in order to reduce that impact on society. And that was something that nobody saw either. They talked about this big hole.
Right, you can't see it when you look up.
Nobody can see it, but the science was there, and
right.
and the science is here now, even though it seems to be emerging science with PFAS and other chemicals. But really, it's the full spectrum of chemicals that we need to be looking
right.
At more clearly. And certainly, if we want to dispose of them, let's dispose of them. Let's not be reintroducing them into
right.
the environment. If these chemicals are moving north,
because our water flows north.
Because the water flows north from here, we're passing that along to our neighbors.
Yeah, we're poisoning Canada.
Yeah,
that's not the act of a good neighbor.
No, and really, what's to say that at some point we don't need the water in this lake for our own drinking water?
We're going to need it.
And yeah, exactly.
It's not even a question.
I mean, are we just going to pass that responsibility onto more corporate interests that then buy and protect water and dole that out to us as, they want to charge for it? Privatizing water, I mean,
is not a solution.
No. And poisoning it is a way to lead to that.
Right.
We may need this water to irrigate crops. We may need it for drinking water. The standards for surface water, which haven't been set, and the state
right.
has been, I thought that they were mandated, by the legislature, that A&R was supposed to take that up and set a limit. We did set a limit on drinking water, which was lower than the EPA's requirement of 70 parts per million. Vermont was courageous in lowering their number to 20 parts per trillion.
Which is still not low enough.
No,
not even close.
And this is emerging science. I mean, the latest science is talking about 1 part per trillion or less. An interesting thing I read the other day too is we're talking about introducing these things back into the environment. So they try to pass things off that this is how much is 5 parts per trillion. Okay, well it's like a drop of salt in 50 Olympic swimming pools or something like that. People can't grasp that at all. Just
it's such a silly analogy.
Yeah, and how infinitesimally small that is.
Yeah.
So think about this. That's such a small quantity. What we dump into our rivers from the wastewater treatment plants in this country alone equates to 1,500 pounds of PFAS per year.
It's a lot.
It is when you think of how small that part
Molecule,
per trillion is, but 1,500 pounds of it. It's enormous.
Yes.
It just doesn't make sense to keep doing this, knowing that it's going to remain there for 50, 75 years longer. It's being taken up by fish. I mean, why is it that we have advisories on eating fish? And this is all over the country, all over the world. Drinking water advisories. Don't consume these types of animals, in excess of certain amounts.
Swimming advisories.
They were contaminated by the natural environment.
Right.
They were contaminated by us, and we haven't stopped doing that.
Nope.
And it's only going to get worse.
So on that cheery note,
yes,
we need to stop for today. But locally, what we can do is make sure that leachate never, ever goes into our local waterways. That it never goes into the Memphrey-Magog watershed, that it never goes into Lake Memphrey-Magog. Yeah. And we can push the state as individuals to come up with real solutions for real problems.
Absolutely. Yeah, we're very fortunate here. I love this lake. We get out on it as much as we can. We have kayaks, we have a boat. But we're very lucky here that there is not a lot of industry.
Right.
I say that, I mean, it's nice to have industry because it employs people, but, things aren't being dumped into our lake. So it's pretty good. We've got agricultural runoff and such like that we're trying to control.
And stormwater runoff.
Runoff. And there, there was a tannery here, right on where the dock is now. There was a rail yard down here, where Vista is and such. There was a dump.
Some industry.
There was a dump where our playground is in the park. So we still have those contaminants lingering around, but we're actively taking contaminants and putting them into what could be really an absolutely pristine lake, when it really isn't necessary. This is an industry, the waste industry needs to learn how to deal with these materials more effectively. They're getting paid for it. This is the business that they've aligned themselves to be in. It has engineering, and technological, advances that they investigate and employ. This is one of them that they need to address and contain these materials, find a way to destroy them. They've had plenty of time to do so.
Right. So let's figure out how we can move forward as a community.
Sure. And
this is a community issue.
Yeah, and I'm all for, doing this the right way and even helping them to find the right way. But we got to do it with, scientific knowledge and also the disposal of the remains of this into the lakes and streams, just not acceptable anymore.
Exactly. Thank you so much for coming in today.
Thank you for letting me get a bit of that off my chest.
This is going to be part of a series, and hopefully will include young people coming in and talking about what they're doing, because some of the schools and some of the individual groups are doing a lot.
Oh, excellent.
Which is great.
Yeah.
So thank you for coming.
Thank you, Pam.